This is video number 5 in a series of acrylic painting techniques. This video will be primarily showing you the tools for creating line, shape, and form with paint. Some basic techniques beyond what you've already seen in the initial process videos. At the top side of the board, you'll probably notice a theme in the next 5 videos about reducing, reusing, and upcycling whenever possible. It's good to conserve what you take to begin with, including when you take paint or materials. With the paint, obviously, I've been promoting taking just what you need right now with the paint, rather than a whole bunch of paint at the same time, but also that goes with the surface that you paint on. So, for example, you can paint on some canvas, but this is obviously a new material, not reused. This is actually a reused piece of cardboard, actually the back of the book of canvas sheets that this came from. I just put gesso on this. This actually makes a pretty sturdy surface to paint on. You could definitely reuse cardboard. It's literally everywhere. You get it in the mail all the time, and you can construct a lot of things out of cardboard and paint on it as well. But for my demonstration board, I just also wanted to shout out Restore and Habitat for Humanity. I bought this piece of oak or maple. It's about 12 by 20 inches. It's an old cabinet door. Got it for $3. Actually, it was on sale, 30% off, because it was there for more than 3 months, so it was close to a little bit more than $2. But did want to shout out that organization Restore. They do actually have sometimes free wood, also really discounted wood that you can use, and all of that goes to support the organization Habitat for Humanity, which, if you don't know about Habitat for Humanity, they're an organization that solicits donations from construction companies and such to build new homes for homeless folks out of unused construction supplies. So whatever they don't use for new homes, they actually sell at their place called Restore, and they use the profits to support Habitat for Humanity. So great organization. They exist in, I think, most of the United States, and they also employ AmeriCorps volunteers, which AmeriCorps is also a really good organization that's nonprofit and a good way to serve your country if you want an alternative to military service. I wouldn't be a teacher without AmeriCorps, actually, so I got to shout them out for sure. But anyway, this is the board that I will be making my demonstration pieces on, and I wanted to demonstrate how to paint the lines on this. But first I want to show you the tools. First off, you'll have some kind of palette, a place where you mix your paint before you start working. At school we have these metal, ceramic coated, very durable palettes that you can use over and over again. You can cover them with saran wrap to preserve the paint, but this only usually works for a few hours, maybe not overnight. And so we also don't always have the space in order to store a bunch of full palettes. So usually we just want you to clean them out when you're done. Or you can allow the paint to dry and just reuse it that way. Once this paint is dry, again, it's acrylic and it turns into plastic basically, so it's not going to mix with the other paints as you mix them on here. So you can continue to use a palette like this, or you can clean it off, whichever way you prefer. If it does get dried like this, just know that one way to clean it off is to use a palette knife. You can simply scrape, and since these are very durable, you can scrape excess paint off that way. But I find that also another way to get rid of the excess paint on dried acrylic palettes. You can soak them in water for about a minute or two, then use an SOS pad, and this will lift off. Just make sure you use a strainer in your sink when you do that, so that these big chunks of acrylic paint that come off, make sure that the strainer's there so that you don't end up clogging the sink with big chunks of paint. Next you have palette knives. They're very useful for mixing paint, also for applying paint to the surface, and of course cleaning your palette as well. These are different types that I have at home. We have different shapes at school as well that I don't have here, but they all generally work in the same way. And so those are palette knives. Next we have different kinds of brushes. So there's all different kinds of brushes available. There's straight edge, there is some round brushes, there are finer ones, there are bigger ones. You can even make brushes out of a single strand like I've done here. They're all generally made out of either animal hair or synthetic hair, and acrylic usually is best with synthetic, so that's what a lot of our brushes are at school, but I have a variety here. In general, brushes look like this. They have the bristles here that are held in here by a metal ferrule. It's usually crimped onto the brush somewhere in this area, so it's generally good not to pull too hard on the bristles or the ferrule, or it will actually separate from the wooden handle. In the brush, there's the tip. Down in here, the kind of central area, is called the belly of the brush. That's what holds a lot of paint. Got to make sure you really clean that out when you clean your brushes so that you can use them over and over again. Especially when you're using really big brushes like our gesso brushes. they hold so much more in the belly that you really have to rinse them out a long time. And if you've ever painted walls at your house and used a larger brush and had to rinse them out afterward, you know what I mean. There's other kinds of tools that you can use to apply paint though. We have different kinds of shaping brushes for modeling and making textures in acrylic this way. You can make, I've made brushes out of just a single strand. Here, this one's made out of a single strand of cat hair. Sometimes you can find like whiskers on the ground. I have cats at home, and so occasionally I'll find a whisker and turn it into a brush. You also may need some kind of masking tools. So masking tape is usually pretty good. You can also cut larger masks with an X-Acto knife out of paper or other material, Frisket paper, for example. It's like a sticky kind of masking material, but it's also very expensive. So paper usually generally works pretty well with acrylic paint. You can also use a French curve. This is a tool that can be applied to the surface, and you can draw curves with this, but you could also use this to mask edges and use a stencil brush along the edge to make sure that you don't get underneath it. And then just, of course, if you use this for painting, make sure that you clean it just like anything else. It's made out of plastic, so the paint should lift off if you get it wet and scrub it. So you're gonna want some kind of cup to hold some water for when you're painting. You always wanna make sure that you have that so that when you're not using your brushes, you can just drop them in there and make sure that your brushes won't dry out. If you just leave your brushes sitting on the table, they will dry out in a matter of minutes. So just when you're not using your brushes, put them in some water. I don't have any water in here yet. You also may want paper towels to dry the brush after you've dipped it in the water. You can also clean excess paint off of this brush that way as well. You may want some kind of tools to draw on the surface with. I recommend graphite. It's non-reactive with the paint. You can also use pens and Sharpies, but they have some chemicals in them that sometimes bleed into paints, depending on what kind of paint you're using. So graphite's highly recommended. It does kind of smear sometimes with water. So if you're using wet, very wet paint, it may move around, but generally it will stay where you put it. You also may need some sandpaper. If you like to really gesso the surface and make a nice smooth surface, you can use some fine-tooth sandpaper to really sand between each layer of your gesso and create a really smooth surface. That way, if you're doing really fine details, like with the cat hair brush, for example, you may need a really smooth surface. Otherwise, those really fine brush strokes will not be replicated with fidelity. In order to show you how to mask and do that sort of thing, I'm gonna actually use the demonstration board itself. I'm gonna paint some lines on here. And you could just freehand paint the lines if you wanted to. If you're patient enough, you could get a fine liner type brush and really just go at it. Like I could try to paint these lines really straight, but that just might take me a really long time. So what you can do instead is actually mask off the different areas that you want to paint. And you can use a stencil brush, which is a wider kind of round brush, and just push down as you go along here. With tape, it kind of sticks down, so you don't have to worry about getting paint underneath it, but you also don't want to put too much paint down because, especially with acrylic, I've noticed it will form a layer over the top of the tape, and if allowed to dry with that layer, when you peel the tape off, it might actually lift some of the paint up too. So one way to avoid that is just to go ahead and peel the tape off right away after you've painted the line. So for example, I'm gonna do it right here, and you notice the way that I'm doing it is I'm picking the tape up and I'm peeling it at a 45-degree angle. Now, this paint here is still wet, so I just wanna make sure that I'm not touching that paint to any other surface as I peel this up. And you can see that in places where the tape maybe isn't adhered all the way down to the surface, the paint will get underneath the tape. You can also tape off different shapes. So I've got sort of this rectangle shape here. I'm gonna paint some paint into that, and we'll see what that looks like later. And again, I'm gonna try this one. This one I'm gonna let dry as well, just like this other one. I'm just making some lines here to divide the space up for this tool. But again, you can do any kind of shape. In fact, you can make, generally with masking tape, you can make convex curves, meaning curves that go outward very easily, even with the same piece of tape, just by curving it as you apply it. So you can get curvy shapes that way. You can do the other way, but you just have to tear tape into smaller bits, usually, in order to do that. So you can also get concave curves, but Generally, you have to use more tape to do that. And you can paint those sorts of things there as well. And again, as I peel it up, I'm just peeling away from the painted edge. Of course, I could just paint that sort of thing by hand as well. And you can see it gets a different kind of texture by hand. But I'm going to go ahead and paint all of these lines on here. You can also mask with pieces of paper. You can just lay them down. Just got a couple pieces of canvas here. Mask this corner of this line here. And this is especially important to use a stencil brush and this pressing down technique. And you'll notice that some areas where it might get underneath the stencil, it actually sticks to the underneath part. So you do want to lift your stencil up before it dries if you're doing this sort of thing, because often it will bleed underneath the stencil. And the difference there is that tape just has a sticky adherent surface, so it doesn't often get as much of that, although it does a little bit sometimes, especially where it doesn't fully adhere. And of course, just like with anything, it's good to reuse if you can. So with these strips of tape, I could reuse them. As I paint this line, once I'm finished with it, I could move them over here, finish painting that line, I can move them around and finish all the lines that way and use the same tape over and over again. So. Depending on what kind of shapes you need to paint, you can use a different kind of brush. Square brush can create straight lines. So you could create a rectangle without masking, just with a brush. Liner brush or a round brush like this, used to make different kinds of shapes, like a line with this liner. A round brush, make more round shapes, it holds a little more paint, and it can get wider or thinner depending on how hard you press it. Larger brushes for covering larger areas. We have all kinds. Just get the right tool for the right job. Sometimes your paint may be a little bit too transparent. Either you've added too much water or just by the nature of the... So you can always come back over it and add another layer to make it more opaque, meaning that it doesn't let as much of the background color through, or it's not as transparent. So here's a really good example of why using graphite is better than using Sharpie, for example, to draw your lines. As you can see, this Sharpie has bled into this acrylic paint right here. And so you can see that blue bleeding into it. So it may not always be a desirable effect, so I would suggest to use graphite to draw your lines on your painting surface instead.